The fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth. A whole table of strangers turned to look at me. And in that suspended moment, with string lights humming overhead and the scent of wedding flowers heavy in the air, I understood something I had been running from for 3 full years. There are moments you feel tilt before they fall. This was one. The woman who had just introduced me as the unemployed one who lives off the family was my sister. She had spent 40 years building a version of reality where I was the cautionary tale and she was the triumph. And in 30 seconds, standing in front of her CEO at my son's wedding, she was about to discover that reality was a house of cards. But here is what none of them knew. Not my sister. Not the CEO, not even my own son. The man she was trying so desperately to impress had spent 3 years searching for me. And when he finally found me, it was not in a boardroom or a conference hall. It was at a back table at a vineyard wedding, introduced as a woman who didn't matter anymore. I laughed. I had practiced laughing. Then the man beside her set his glass down on the linen, slow and careful. And I watched my sister's smile freeze on her face. Welcome back to Calm Drama Vault. We sit here with the quiet women. Nobody counts. The sisters and daughters and mothers who carry the weight of entire families on their backs while the world keeps asking what they've produced lately. The women who step out of the spotlight and discover, to their horror and their liberation, that the spotlight was never the point. Drop a comment where you're watching from. And if you've ever been the one standing at the edge of a room while someone else narrated your worth, hit that subscribe button. Because this story belongs to you. My name is Melanie Sinclair. And I am 46 years old. For most of that wedding, I stood at the edge of the reception hall with a glass of wine going warm in my hand. I have gotten good at edges. 3 years ago, I would not have known where the edge of a room even was. Because I was always at the center of one. Usually at the head of the table. Usually the one everyone waited on before they started. I ran strategy for companies whose names you would know. I built the kind of career people write case studies about. And I did it without a wealthy father, or a lucky marriage, or a soft landing anywhere. Self-made, they used to call me. Back when anyone bothered to call me anything at all. Now I was the woman by the coat check, watching my son Ethan laugh with his new wife. And I felt the strange peace of a person who has already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing and survived it. Anyway, Ethan looked so much like my mother when he smiled. Nobody at that reception knew that. Nobody there had watched me sit by a hospital bed for 2 years or knew the ledger of everything those 2 years had quietly emptied out of my life. To them, I was Sandra's sister. The one who didn't have a job. The one you are kind to the way you are kind to a stray. I let them think it. I had learned that being underestimated is its own kind of quiet. A shield you can wear when the world has exhausted you. But underestimation is a loan, not a gift. And somebody always comes to collect. The call came on a Tuesday. A little over 3 years before the wedding. I remember it because I was standing in a glass conference room, 40 floors up when my phone lit with my mother's name. I was days from being named managing partner. I had spent 20 years reaching for that specific door and it was finally swinging open. I stepped out to take the call. Half annoyed. My mother said the word pancreatic. And then she said the word stage 4. And the 40 floors under me seemed to go very quiet. She was 68. The doctors gave her numbers, and the numbers were small. I did the only math that mattered to me while I stood in that hallway, with the city spread out below like something I no longer cared about. I could keep the door or I could keep the time. I did not agonize the way people expect you to. I went back into the room and I told the partners. I was withdrawing my name. And I watched 20 years rearrange themselves into something else. Sandra was in a different city then. I called her that night. My sister said something to me on that call, quick and light, that I did not understand for 3 whole years. When I finally understood it, I understood everything else about her too. But that came much later. At a table with white flowers and a man setting down his glass. That night, I only heard the words and let them go. Here is the thing people get wrong about my sister and me. We were both asked. When it became clear our mother could not be alone, the family had a version of a meeting. The kind that happens over speakerphone with too many people talking. Somebody said it plainly. One of us would have to step back. Sandra was a manager then. Mid-level. Clawing her way up a firm she was terrified of falling out of. And when the question landed, she said, "I can't just throw away everything I've built." She said it fast. Like she'd rehearsed it. Like she needed us to hear the certainty before we heard the refusal. And the awful truth is that I understood her. I have thrown away everything I built. I know the exact weight of it. Sandra was not a cartoon. She was a woman who had climbed a long ladder in the rain and could not imagine letting go of a single rung. So I said I would do it. I said it the way you volunteer for the thing nobody else will touch. Half pride and half love. Not knowing yet that the world keeps two different sets of books. One for the people who stay, and one for the people who leave. I did not resent her then. I want to be honest about that. The resentment came later. And it did not come from the caregiving. It came from what she decided the caregiving meant. 2 years is a long time when it is measured in medication schedules. I learned the language of oncology, the way I once learned the language of mergers. Fluently and against my will. I sold my apartment and moved into something smaller so the numbers would stretch. I drove her to appointments at 6 in the morning and learned which nurses were gentle and which were merely fast. My phone, which had once buzzed all day with people who needed my judgment, went quiet. And then it went dead. And I did not have the energy to grieve that on top of everything else. Some nights, my mother would surface from the fog of the drugs and look at me with perfect clarity. And one of those nights she said something I have carried like a stone in my pocket ever since. She held my hand and she said, "They'll measure you by the room you're in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." I told her she was being dramatic. She told me she was dying and had earned the right. We both laughed, and it was a real laugh. Not the practice kind. That was the last good week. There is a mercy in not knowing which week is the last. One until it is already behind you. My mother died in the spring. And something curious happened at her funeral. People began talking about me in the past tense, not about her. About me. An aunt patted my arm and said it was such a shame what I'd given up, wasn't it? And how I used to be so impressive. Sandra flew in for 2 days. Wore beautiful black. And cried in a way that made several people comfort her. By the end of the reception, she had somehow become the grieving daughter, and I had become the tired woman who'd been handling things. She told a cousin warmly that she was so worried about me. That she hoped I could find my footing again. As though I had wandered off a path rather than carried our mother to the end of hers. Stood in my mother's kitchen holding a casserole dish somebody had brought. And I felt the whole story of the last 2 years being quietly rewritten around me by people who had not been in the room for any of it. That is the thing. Nobody warns you about caregiving. You give up the visible life. And then the people with visible lives get to narrate what your invisible one was worth. Sandra was already building her version. And her version did not have me in it as a hero. It had me in it as a warning. A year passed. I did the paperwork of death, which is its own second job. And I let myself feel nothing much. And slowly I started sleeping again. Then Ethan called with the best news I'd had in years. He was getting married. He'd met Claire and she was kind and steady and clearly good for him. And when he asked me to be there, my whole chest ached with something that wasn't grief for once. But near the end of that call, my son got quiet, and then he said the thing that told me exactly where I stood now. "Mom," he said, "Aunt Sandra's going to be there and she's got her whole thing about you being between jobs." And can you not engage with it? For me? It's just one day. He was 24 and terrified of a scene at his own wedding. And I could hear that he loved me and was ashamed of asking in the same breath. I said, "Of course, honey. Of course." And I meant it. And it cost me something I didn't have a name for yet. Because in that one small sentence, my own son had told me which sister was the problem to be managed. Not the one who mocked. The one who might mind being mocked. I hung up and sat in the quiet a long time. Then I asked him gently one more thing. Where was it he worked again? This firm he was so proud of. He told me the name like it was nothing. Meridian Strategy Group. I kept my voice even and said that was a good firm. And he said, yeah, Aunt Sandra had actually helped him get the interview. She was a manager there and he was just an analyst, but he was learning a ton. I said I was proud of him. And I was. and I did not tell him what that name meant to me because I knew Meridian. I had competed against Meridian for a decade. I had beaten them on pitches and lost to them on others. And years ago, I had built a framework, a way of mapping a company's real decisions against its stated ones that had gotten around the industry the way good ideas do. Uncredited and everywhere. The last I'd heard, Meridian had adopted a version of it wholesale. By now, it would just be house knowledge there. The way a tool becomes so ordinary that no one remembers it ever had an author, and Sandra had climbed her whole career standing on top of it, without a single reason to know whose name had once been on it. Least of all a sister she'd never once thought to ask. My son worked inside the house I used to lay siege to. Under my sister in a world I had ruled and then walked out of. And none of them knew it because none of them had ever asked me a single real question about who I'd been. I could have told Ethan that night. I want you to understand that I chose not to, not out of some clever plan. I was just so tired of being the woman explaining that she used to matter. Let them find out or not. I was going to a wedding to watch my son be happy. And I owed no one my resume. The rehearsal dinner was Friday. Claire's family had money. The quiet kind. And the rehearsal dinner was in a private room at a restaurant, where the waiters folded your napkin when you went to the restroom. I wore the one good dress I had kept from my old life and felt like a museum piece of myself. Claire's parents were gracious in the careful way of people who don't quite know what to make of you. And Sandra, my sister, walked into that room like she had booked it herself. She wore success like a fragrance. She had a new watch and a newer confidence. And within 10 minutes, she was holding a small court by the window, telling stories that all seemed to end with her being right. I watched my son watch her with something like envy. And I understood the shape of the evening before it happened. Sandra was the family's success story tonight. And every story needs its contrast. I got a glass of wine and found a chair near the edge, which by now felt less like exile and more like a good vantage point. From the edge, you see everything. From the edge, you see who a person is when they think the important people are looking. And Sandra all night kept glancing toward the door, waiting for someone who mattered more than the rest of us to arrive. The person Sandra was waiting for did not come to the rehearsal dinner. But he came up in every third sentence. My CEO, she kept saying. David is incredibly selective. She told a long story about a presentation she'd given him, about how demanding he was, how he'd once rejected an entire deck, and how she'd stayed up all night fixing it and won him over. She said his name the way some people say the name of a saint they're hoping will notice their devotion. David Mercer. She dropped it in front of Claire's father, who nodded politely, and in front of my son, who beamed because his aunt worked so closely with the great man. And she dropped it while looking at me, as if to make sure I understood the distance between a woman who reported to David Mercer and a woman who reported to no one at all. I sipped my wine and said nothing. The name meant nothing to me yet. I had left the industry before Mercer's time at the top and I had never met him. But Sandra didn't know that either. She just knew that I used to be somebody and now was no one. And she wanted the somebody in me to hear how far she had climbed. She wanted an audience for her ascent. She had no idea. She was about to get one. It was Claire's mother who asked me kindly over the salad course. And what do you do, Melanie? A simple question. A human one. I opened my mouth to answer it honestly. To say that I'd stepped back from consulting to care for my mother and was thinking about what came next. Which is the truth and not a shameful one. But Sandra answered for me before I got the first word out. She laughed a light little laugh and said, "Oh, Mel's between things right now." She's been between things for a while. She said it fondly. That was the genius of it. She wrapped the knife in fondness so that anyone who flinched would look unkind for flinching. Claire's mother smiled uncertainly and moved the conversation along. And I sat there having been introduced in front of my son's new family as a woman defined entirely by absence. Between things. As if I were a hallway. As if the 2 years I'd spent holding a dying woman's hand were a gap in a timeline rather than the fullest thing I'd ever done. I felt the old professional part of me. The part that had sat across from hostile boardrooms. Go very calm and very cold. I said, that's one way to put it. Sandra. And I let it drop because it was Ethan's weekend and I had promised. But I filed it. Some words you file. I stepped outside after the entree to breathe. And Claire followed me. My son had married up in the only way that matters. She was the kind of person who notices when someone has gone quiet. She stood next to me in the cool air and didn't fill the silence right away, which told me a lot about her. Then she said, Ethan told me you took care of your mom for a couple of years. That must have been really hard. And that was it. That was the whole thing. She asked me about the actual life I had lived instead of the empty space around it. I told her a little. I told her about the 6 a.m. drives and the gentle nurses and the last good week. She listened like it was worth listening to. At one point, she said, that's not nothing, you know? That's kind of everything. I had to look away at the string lights for a moment. It is a strange thing to have your own son's wife be the first person in 3 years to hand you back a piece of yourself. When we went back inside, Sandra was mid-story again. And Claire caught my eye across the room and made a small private face. The kind that says, I see it too. I had an ally now. I didn't know yet how much I would need one. Or how little in the end I would use her. The moment I keep coming back to happened over dessert. And it happened with paper. Claire's father mentioned in passing that he might need some consulting help for his own company down the line. Nothing serious. Just thinking out loud. And Sandra moved like a shark that has smelled the water change. She reached into her bag and produced her business cards. Meridian Strategy Group embossed in navy. Her name and her title in clean type. And she fanned them out on the tablecloth like a winning hand of cards. And slid them toward Claire's father with a smile. Then she turned to me. She let the pause sit, just long enough for the table to feel it. And she said, do you have one to give them, Mel? Anything at all? The table went quiet in that specific way. Everyone understood the question was not about business cards. It was about whether I existed, and I did not have one. I had left my old cards in a drawer 3 years ago along with the rest of that life. And I had not made new ones because I did not yet know what they would say. So I sat there empty-handed in front of my son and his new family. While my sister's little navy cards lay, fanned across the linen like proof of who was real and who was not, I smiled and said no. I was fresh out. Sandra smiled back, satisfied. And the dessert plates came, and the moment passed for everyone. But me. I would carry those fan cards in my mind. All the way to the reception. If you have ever stood in a room holding nothing while someone spread their little cards like a winning hand, you know the exact sound that silence makes. Tell me in the comments. Did you smile too? Stay with me. This one turns. That night, back in my small apartment, I did something I hadn't done in a long while. I took down a box from the top of the closet. Not documents. Not old contracts. Nothing I could have waved in Sandra's face. Just a photograph. It was of my mother and me at an industry conference maybe 15 years back. Both of us laughing at something outside the frame. Me in a badge and a blazer. Her having flown in just to watch me give a keynote she didn't understand a word of. She used to do that. She'd sit in the back of rooms where her daughter was the expert and she'd beam. I sat on the floor of my apartment and looked at that photo. And I asked myself the question I had been outrunning for 3 years. If I don't produce anything, am I anything? If no one is measuring me, do I still count? It's an ugly question to catch yourself asking. It meant that some part of me had started to believe Sandra's math. The world's math. The arithmetic that says a woman with no title is a woman with no worth. I didn't cry over it. I just sat with the picture and let the question be honest for once. Because you cannot fix a rot you refuse to name. My mother's voice came back to me from that last good week. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way. I put the photo in my purse. I don't know why. I just wanted her at the wedding. The morning of the wedding, Ethan needed help with his tie. He always has. He came to me in the little room off the Vineyards Chapel with the ends of it hanging loose and that helpless look he's had since he was 6. And I stepped in and did the knot the way my own father taught me. His hands were shaking a little. Nerves. I smoothed his collar and looked at my boy in his suit and had to breathe carefully. He looked at me in the mirror. Both of us reflected Dot, and for a second, his face crumpled just slightly. "Mom," he said. "About what I asked you on the phone about Aunt Sandra." "That wasn't fair of me." "I know it wasn't." I told him it was fine. He said, "It's just she gets loud and I didn't want." And I stopped him. I said, "Honey, this is your day. And I am not going to be a single ounce of trouble in it. That's a promise. And I mean it as a gift and not a sacrifice." He hugged me too hard. The way he did when he was small and scared of thunder. Over his shoulder, I could see the vineyard through the window. The white chairs. The people arriving. I had promised him peace. And I intended to keep that promise. What I did not yet know was that peace was not mine to keep or break. Someone else was going to reach for the pin. The ceremony was beautiful and short, which is the correct way for a ceremony to be. Then came the reception in a long hall with open sides and grape vines climbing the posts and string lights against the dusk. They had seated me well back at a table with a great-aunt and two of Claire's college friends. Which I understood. The front tables were for the people the day was performing for. From back there, I watched my sister work the room, and I watched her orbit one man in particular. An older man, mid-50s, silver at the temples, in a suit that fit like it had been grown rather than bought. He was calm in the way genuinely powerful people are calm, taking up no more space than he needed. Sandra circled him all evening. She refreshed his drink. She laughed a half-second too long at whatever he said. I could see even from the back that this was David, the CEO, the saint whose name she'd worn like perfume. And that he had come to my son's wedding because Ethan was one of his young analysts. And that Sandra had decided this evening was her chance. I didn't recognize him. I only recognized the choreography because I had once been the person a room arranged itself around. And I knew what it looked like when someone wanted very badly to be arranged around. I sipped my wine. My glass had gone warm again. And then Sandra looked across the hall, found me at my little back table, and began walking my way with the man in tow. I knew what was coming the way. You know whether. Sandra crossed the hall with David Mercer at her elbow, steering him toward my table. And I understood that I was about to be used as scenery. She wanted to show her CEO how gracious she was. How she carried her poor between-jobs sister. How far above her own origins she had risen. Some people build themselves up. Sandra had only ever learned to build herself up by standing on someone. And tonight the someone was me. At a wedding. In front of the most important man in her professional world, I set my glass down. I straightened my back the way I used to before walking into a hostile boardroom. An old reflex. Muscle memory from a life, these people thought, I'd never had. Claire across the room saw the trajectory and started moving too. Though she was too far to matter. My son was near the head table laughing, unaware. And Sandra arrived at my table glowing. Gestured at me with an open hand like a hostess presenting a curiosity. Took a breath. And turned to the calm silver-haired man beside her to make her introduction. I looked up at both of them and waited. There are moments you feel tilt before they fall. This was one. And my sister. So sure of the floor beneath her, so certain of who counted in that room and who did not. Opened her mouth. "David," Sandra said, bright as a bell. "This is my sister I was telling you about, Melanie, the unemployed one. Lives off the family. She's been between things for years now. Bless her." She said it to a CEO at a wedding about her own sister. And she said it smiling as if it were affection. The great aunt beside me inhaled. One of Claire's friends looked at her plate. And I did the thing I had trained myself to do over 3 years of being narrated by people who were never in the room. I laughed. It was not bitter. It was almost gentle. And then I looked at the man, this David, and I said the truest and quietest thing I could. The thing that closed a door behind me even as I said it. "She's right," I said. "I don't have a title anymore." I meant it as surrender, I think, in that first second. I meant you win, Sandra. I'm done fighting the story. But some sentences turn in your mouth as you say them, because the moment the words were out, I felt them stop being an apology. I don't have a title anymore. As if a title had ever been the thing that made me. My mother's voice moved under the words, and across the table, the calm man went very still and set his glass down on the linen, slow and deliberate, and looked at me the way no one had looked at me in 3 years, like I was a person worth focusing on. "I'm sorry," the man said to me, ignoring my sister entirely. "I don't think we've met properly." "What did you say your name was?" His voice was courteous and low, and something in it had changed. A note of attention that hadn't been there a moment before. I told him. "Melanie," I said. Sandra jumped in to fill the space because Sandra cannot bear a space. "Sinclair," she added. "She's a Sinclair like me, obviously." And she laughed again, wanting the conversation back on rails she controlled. The man's eyes didn't leave my face. "Melanie Sinclair," he repeated slowly. And I watched something surface behind his eyes. Some file being pulled from a deep shelf. Not the Melanie Sinclair. Not the one who wrote the decision mapping framework. The great aunt looked confused. Sandra's smile developed a hairline crack. Because those were not words she had ever expected to hear attached to the sister. She had spent years shrinking. I felt my own pulse in my ears. I said carefully, "I wrote a version of it, yes, a long time ago." "And the man?" "David Mercer, CEO of Meridian Strategy Group. The firm my sister was so afraid of falling out of," exhaled a short surprised breath, almost a laugh, and shook his head slowly, and said, "A long time ago. My entire analytics division still runs on your long time ago." The table had gone completely silent now. Sandra's hand found the back of a chair. He told it simply. Which somehow made it worse for Sandra. He said that Meridian had adopted my framework across the entire firm years ago. That it was, in his words, the backbone of how they made decisions. And that 3 years back, when he had taken over as CEO, the very first outside hire he had wanted to make was the woman who'd built it. "Every recruiting cycle for 3 years, he said, I had my team put your name back at the top of the list and try again. He said you'd gone quiet. Completely off the map. No firm, no board seats, nothing. I assumed you'd been poached by someone who buried you in an NDA or gone to a competitor overseas." He shook his head. "I couldn't understand how someone that good just vanishes." I said evenly, "My mother got sick. I went to take care of her. She died last year." The words landed in that quiet hall with a weight that even Sandra could not talk over. David Mercer looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, "So while I had a team searching every firm in the country for you, you were where exactly?" And I said, "At a hospital. Then at a funeral. Then figuring out what came next." He nodded slowly. And something in his face had gone from professional interest to something more like respect. And beside him, my sister had turned the specific shade of gray that comes when a story you've told for years collapses in a single sentence. In front of the one person you most needed it to hold. Now my sister had a choice in that moment. And I want to be fair to her because there was a version of this where she recovered gracefully. She could have said, "Of course, I'm so proud of my sister. Look at what she stepped away from." She could have let the truth reframe her into the family member of someone remarkable. But Sandra had spent so many years needing me to be small that she could not stop reaching for the shears. Even as the ground gave way, she let out a nervous laugh and said, "Well, I mean, that was ages ago, David. She's not really in the industry anymore. She's been out for years. You know how it is. The field moves on." She said it to diminish me reflexively. The way you might swat at a wasp, but she said it to her CEO about a woman he had just called the backbone of his firm. At a wedding. Having just introduced that same woman as an unemployed loser who lived off the family. And I watched David Mercer turn his head slowly and look at my sister. "Don't really look at her. The way you look at a document you are reading for the second time and catching what you missed." The warmth left his face. Not into anger. Into something colder and more final. He set down the drink she had so carefully refreshed all night. And the whole hall seemed to hold its breath. Forks suspended. the string lights humming. Everyone at the nearby tables now openly watching. "Sandra," David Mercer said. And his voice was quiet. So quiet that people leaned in without meaning to. "I've heard you speak about people at the office." I've told myself it was ambition. Sharp elbows. "I gave you room." He paused. "But I just watched you introduce your own sister, a woman our entire firm is indebted to, as an unemployed loser at her son's wedding to impress me." He let that sit. "That tells me everything I needed to know and didn't want to." Sandra started to say his name. Started to say, "David, please." And he raised one hand. Not unkindly. Just finally. "This isn't the place. And I won't make it one. But HR will be in touch first thing Monday. And I think you already know why." He said it the way you'd note the time. No shouting. No scene. The most powerful man in the room had simply calmly ended her. And he had done it not because I was brilliant, but because she was cruel. And there is a difference. And everyone at that table felt the difference. Sandra made a sound I'd never heard from her. Small and airless. And here is what surprised me. I did not feel the rush I might have imagined. The hot, bright flood of vindication. I looked at my sister's face going to pieces in front of Claire's family and my son. And what moved through me was something heavier and stranger, because a single quiet sentence had just unmade a woman who thought a title made her untouchable. And I realized, watching her, that I did not actually want her unmade. I wanted something else. And I hadn't found the words for it yet. The table erupted quietly. The way tables do at weddings. Whispers and shifting chairs and someone hurrying to find. Ethan. My son appeared at the edge of it, wide-eyed, looking between his aunt and his mother and his boss, trying to understand how his wedding had turned into this. Claire reached me first. She came around the table and stood beside my chair, one hand light on my shoulder. A young woman planting herself next to the family member everyone else had spent years treating as furniture. And I will love her for that until and Sandra, my sister, sat down heavily in the nearest chair as if her legs had simply quit. For a second, she wasn't angry. She wasn't performing. She looked at me across the wreckage of her own making. And something naked crossed her face. And she said, almost to herself, "You were always the one they remembered." It came out of her like something she'd been holding underwater for 40 years. You were always the one they remembered. And in that one sentence, I finally understood the thing she'd said on the phone 3 years ago. The thing I hadn't been able to parse. She hadn't refused to care for our mother because she was heartless. She'd refused because she was terrified that if she stepped out of her lit room for even a moment, the world would forget she was there at all. The way she believed it had always defaulted to noticing me. Her cruelty was not strength. It was a woman clutching a rung in the rain, certain that letting go meant vanishing. I stood up. Everyone expected me to say something to Sandra, I think. Some final line to close the account she'd kept against me for so long. I didn't. I walked over to David Mercer instead. And I asked if I could have a word. And we stepped a little apart from the table near a post wrapped in grapevine and lights. Up close he was even calmer. A man used to rooms rearranging around him. "That was remarkable," he started to say. "What you built. And I owe you." And I stopped him gently. "Mr. Mercer," I said, "I need to ask you something. And it's going to sound strange." He waited. I said, "Don't fire my sister because of me. If she's crossed a line your firm draws, that's your business. And you should do what your business requires. But I need to know it wasn't a gift to me. I have spent 3 years being defined by other people. And I'm not going to start my next chapter by having a woman destroyed on my behalf. That's not a win I want to own." He studied me for a long moment, the way you study something you weren't expecting to find. And I realized as I said it that I was no longer talking only about Sandra. I was drawing a line about the entire way I would let the world hand me things from now on. Whether insult or reward. And I meant to be the one holding the pen. My whole body felt very quiet. I had just started to become someone I hadn't met yet. David Mercer was quiet for a moment. And then he smiled. A real one. The first I'd seen from him. "You're exactly the person I spent 3 years looking for," he said. "And now I understand why I couldn't find you. People like you don't leave a trail. You leave a legacy and walk off." Then he became businesslike. And he made his pitch. And it was a serious one. He wanted me at Meridian. Not a consulting engagement. A leadership role. A seat at the very top. Running strategy for the whole firm. He named a salary. And the number was large enough that the great aunt, still eavesdropping, made a small noise. He said, Meridian would announce it however I wanted. That he would personally make sure the industry knew Melanie Sinclair was back. That the record would be corrected in a single press release. He would restore in an afternoon everything the last 3 years had quietly taken. And then to seal it, he reached into his jacket, took out one of his own business cards. Heavy stock. His name and his title. And set it down on the little cocktail table between us. Right there where I could take it. A card, after a whole weekend of not having one to give. A man was placing the best card in the room in front of me. Offering to make me real again on his terms. I looked down at it. And I felt the entire evening, the entire 3 years narrow to that one small rectangle of paper. And the choice it was asking me to make. I want to tell you I didn't consider it. That would be a lie. And this story has had enough of those. I considered it hard. Everything in me that had gone hungry for 3 years leaned toward that card. Take it. That part said. Take the title. Take the salary. Take the press release. Walk back into your old life, vindicated. Let the whole industry that watched you vanish watch you return in triumph. Let Sandra read about it. It was by every measure I had used for 20 years. The win. It was the door I'd walked away from, swinging open a second time. And this time no one was dying. This time I could just say yes, and Claire's father would get his consultant. And my son would have a mother with a title again. And the great aunt would revise her past tense sentences. Everything I'd wanted at the start of that weekend was sitting on a cocktail table in a heavy little rectangle, but wanting a thing and needing it are two different accounts. And my mother had taught me to read a balance sheet. Because if I took that card, I would once again be a woman whose worth arrived from the outside, granted by a powerful man, printed on stock I did not choose, restored on someone else's letterhead. I would be real again the exact way Sandra measured real. I would win her game. And a person who wins the other person's game has still agreed to play it. I looked at the card. And I heard my mother clear as the last good week. They'll measure you by the room you're in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way. I understood finally and completely what she had been trying to hand me. Here is what those 2 years by a hospital bed had actually taught me. Though it took a business card on a wedding table for me to finally read it, I had spent my whole life believing my value was the value I produced for other people. Build the framework. Close the deal. Run the room. And you are worth the applause you generate. Stop producing and you are between things. That was the arithmetic. And it was the same arithmetic Sandra lived by. The same one that made her refuse our mother. The same one that had her clutching her Navy cards like a life raft. The same one that had almost convinced me on the floor of my apartment with an old photograph that a woman with no title was a woman with no worth. But I had done the most valuable thing I would ever do in a room, with no applause in it at all. I had sat with my dying mother through 2 years. No one clapped for. No one credited. No one put on a resume. And it had not been a gap. It had been the fullest, truest work of my life. The world had called those years empty. The world was wrong. And I had almost believed the world over my own hands. My mother had seen it coming. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way. She wasn't telling me to build a bigger room than Sandra. She was telling me to stop letting the room do the measuring at all. I looked up from the card and I looked at David Mercer. And for the first time in 3 years, I knew all the way down exactly what I was worth. And that it had never once been printed on anything. I picked up David Mercer's card. I held it for a moment so he would know I understood exactly what I was refusing. And then I set it back down and slid it gently across the little table back to him. Thank you, I said. And I meant it with my whole chest. You have no idea what it means that you remembered. You saw me when my own family had decided I was a cautionary tale. I will carry that. He waited because good negotiators know when something else is coming. I said, but I'm not going to take the seat. And it isn't pride. I chose the words carefully, the way I once chose them for boardrooms. Except now they were only for me. You offered to restore me, to correct the record, put me back where I belonged. But I didn't lose myself out there, David. I didn't get lost. This room just forgot how to see. And that was never my failing to fix by taking a better chair. I don't need to be restored. I need to build my own table. And I'd like it to be one where the first question isn't, what's your title? It's who did you take care of? He was quiet for a long moment. Then David Mercer, CEO of Meridian Strategy Group, did something I will always respect him for. He laughed softly. And he picked his card back up and put it away. And he said, most people take the chair, Melanie. In 30 years, you're the first one I've offered it to who'd rather build the room. He put out his hand. Then I'll be your first client. And don't fire your sister, Melanie. You said, I heard you. What I'm going to do about Sandra, I'm doing for my firm. Not for you. Exactly as you asked. That distinction is yours. I shook his hand. I had walked into that reception with nothing to give anyone. And I was walking out having turned down everything. And I had never in my life felt richer. I went to find my son. Ethan was standing near the cake with Claire, looking like a boy whose beautiful day had cracked down the middle. And when he saw me, his face asked 100 questions at once. I took both his hands. I told him his wedding was still perfect. That nothing that had happened at that table was his to carry. And that his mother was more all right than she had been in 3 years. Which was true. He asked quietly if it was awful what he'd walked into. I said, no, honey. I think it was the opposite of awful. I think it was the night your mother got herself back. Claire hugged me. And over her shoulder I looked across the hall to where Sandra sat alone at the empty table. Her Navy cards nowhere in sight. Staring at nothing, I did not go to her. There was no repairing it that night. Maybe not any night. And I had made my peace with that. But I caught her eye across the room, and I did not gloat. And I did not glare. I gave her one small nod. Not forgiveness. Exactly. Acknowledgement. 2. Sisters raised in the same house by the same rules about who gets to matter. And only one of us had just walked free of them. She looked away first. Then I turned back to my son and his wife. Took a glass of something. And let the wedding be a wedding again for whatever was left of the night. Later, when the dancing had started and no one needed me, I stepped out of the hall and stood in the vineyard dark for a while, listening to the music leak out behind me. I had my mother's photograph in my purse. I took it out and looked at it under the string lights. The two of us laughing at that long ago conference. And I told her quietly that I'd finally understood the thing she'd been trying to give me. And that I was sorry it had taken me so long. 3 years I'd walked out of rooms, feeling myself grow smaller in the doorway. Feeling the invisible arithmetic subtract me a little more each time. That night, I walked out of a room feeling exactly my own size for the first time since she died. I had no title. I had no card. I had turned down a fortune and a throne. And I stood in the dark holding a photograph of a dead woman. And I was not between things. I was finally at the start of my own thing. The music played. The lights swayed. And somewhere behind me, my son was dancing with his wife. And my sister was gathering her coat to go, and the world had not changed at all. Still measuring everyone by the rooms they stood in, but I had changed all the way through. And that turned out to be the only measurement I'd ever needed to correct. That was a little over a year ago. Here is what became of everyone since. I know you'll want to know. I built the table I told David about. Sinclair's strategy is small. Deliberately, 3 people and a handful of clients. And David Mercer was true to his word and became the first of them. Which opened doors I didn't have to knock on twice. It is not an empire. And I don't want one. I've done the version of my life that chases the biggest room. And I'm not going back. The firm is enough. It is mine. And it measures the right things. Sandra left Meridian that Monday. The industry is small and people talk. And the story of what she'd done followed her for a while. And she landed eventually at a lesser firm in another city. A rung lower. Still clutching, we are not close. I've stopped pretending we will be. Some breaks don't heal into something stronger. They just heal enough to stop bleeding. And you learn to live with the scar in the distance. The world's arithmetic didn't change either. It still worships the title and calls the caregiver's years a gap. I couldn't fix that. And I've stopped trying to. But Ethan and Claire come for dinner now. Often, and Claire is pregnant. And my son hugs me like a man who knows exactly what his mother is worth. That's the fallout. Smaller than a fairy tale. Truer than one. It turns out the 3 years I'd been taught to call a gap were the fullest thing I ever did. And a person's worth was never once the sort of thing that fits on a card you can fan across a table. Last week, I interviewed a woman for my firm who'd been out of work 3 years caring for her father. Her hands shook when she got to the gap on her resume. Braced for the usual question. I didn't ask about the gap. I asked her to tell me about her dad. She started to cry. And then she started to talk. And I knew I'd hire her before she finished. I know what it is to be measured by the room you're in. To have people decide your worth based on what you produce, rather than who you carry. To have a sister who needs you small so she can feel large. I know what it is to hold a dying woman's hand for 2 years, and have the world call it a gap. But here is what I also know now. And I want you to carry this with you. The rooms you stand in are not the measure of you. They are temporary stages you pass through. The only room that ever truly belongs to you is the one you build yourself. And in that room, the first question is never, what's your title? It's, who did you take care of? Sandra doesn't know that yet. Maybe she never will, but I do. And now you do too. This is Calm Drama Vault. We sit with the quiet women nobody counts. The ones who carry the weight and never get the credit. The ones the world calls between things. While they're busy being everything. If there's a quiet woman in your life holding more than the room can see, tell her today. Tell her she's not between things. Tell her she's building a room no one else has the courage to build. Subscribe to Calm Drama Vault. Hit that bell. Drop a comment and tell me the story of a woman who was measured by the world and refused to accept the measurement. Because the world's arithmetic is wrong. And the people who sit at the edges of rooms are often the ones who built the whole building. I'll see you in the next vault.